Welcome, everybody. Today we are having our presentation on racism and farm workers. So joining us for this conversation, of course, is our executive director from the National Farm Worker Ministry, Julie Taylor. And also joining the conversation for today is part of the leadership from Community to Community, Rosalinda Guillen. She is the founder of Community to Community and a lead strategist and visionary with the non-hierarchical ecofeminist leadership of C2C. Her perspective is fundamentally influenced by her introduction to the multiracial working class community organizing model of the Rainbow Coalition, the Cesar Chavez House meeting model, the World Social Forum, the landless workers movements of Brazil, and growing up a farm worker in Washington. So she's organized farm workers in Washington State and the strawberry fields of Salinas, California, and has represented farm workers in the legislatures in both California and Washington State, and is joining us today for this very important conversation. As well, we also have Lilo Juarez, who is also a movement builder with C2C. So without further ado, I will pass the mic to Julie Taylor, our executive director.
Thanks so much for joining us today, and we're looking forward to sharing this time with you. Lalo is actually featured in our video for this Harvest of Justice season, and so we're glad that he'll be on the call a little bit later this afternoon. And Reina Lopez, the director of PCUN, is also featured on that. Our website has the resources for farm workers and racism. For the last 5 weeks, we have been dealing with different aspects of it, and so we look forward to sharing sort of a synopsis with you today. We wanted to just start with some basic information. And so when we think in terms of farm workers and racism, you know, farm work in the U.S. was initially done by indentured servants. It moved to the slavery and the vestiges of slavery after that to sharecropping and exclusions today in labor laws. Our food system, because of that, is rooted in racism. And so today our nation's farm workers continue to face challenges and risks connected with that very legacy. And we wanted to address this with you. So when we speak about exclusions from the labor laws, so we want to talk about two of the very basic labor laws that are in play in the United States. In the mid-1930s, the U.S. passed several of those laws, but both of those major laws excluded farm workers and domestic workers. In 1935, the National Labor Relations Act provided the right to organize without retaliation. Specifically, though, farm workers and domestic workers were left out of the benefits of that labor. In the past and today, farm workers are predominantly people of color. They were and are excluded because of racism. One legislator from Florida argued in 1937 for the exclusion of farm workers from the Farm Labor Standards Act and stated on the congressional record, you cannot put the Negro and the white man on the same basis and get away with it. So a big reason that farm workers were excluded is because during that period of negotiations, most of the farm workers in this country were African American, and they were Black farm workers. The domestic workers were the same. These were the leftover pieces of slavery. So, and just to mention that today, predominantly farm workers are Latino. During World War II, especially, there was really a strong transition, and farm workers immigrated into the U.S. or came from the South to work in our fields. So today, predominantly farm workers are of Hispanic backgrounds and operate in this country that way, still victims of racism. So to talk about specific aspects of the way that racism impacts farm workers in the U.S., we look at environmental racism, the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color, from temperature changes to natural disasters to environmental hazards. Farm workers are on the front lines of climate change. We often say that they are the closest to the ground, so they experience the impact of environmental changes and challenges more so than anyone else. When we look statistically around the country and the impact of environmental racism on ethnic minority groups, on average, people of color make up 56% of the population living in neighborhoods that have toxic released inventory facilities. For the most part, everybody else is 30%. So a higher number of our people of color, specifically Black people, are exposed to the environmental racism in our communities.
How's it going?
Good.
So, so another way that environmental racism impacts farm workers is through toxic pesticides. Farm workers are at a disproportionate risk from exposure to pesticides, and these cause short-term and long-term illnesses for workers and their families. Although farm workers are often recognized as an environmental justice community, the U.S. government's regulations and policies offer workers little to no protections against environmental hazards. Pesticides play a big role in this. Farm workers are exposed to, even today, crop sprays. And once pesticides are sprayed onto fields, they often dry. And then farm workers who work near fields or who they themselves and their families live near fields are exposed to pesticide drift, which comes as those pesticides dry and turn to powder and then just flow through the air. It makes it easy for pesticides to cling to farm worker clothing, and then farm workers take those pesticides home to their families, where children are especially vulnerable to the impact of the health risks that pesticides pose. Another challenge with toxic pesticides is they are required to be labeled in this country, but they're often not necessarily labeled in the languages of farm workers, both for application and then for their exposure. And so we talk about modern day slavery as a way in which farm workers are impacted, that this environmental racism, that the nature of who does farm work in this country and the exploitation of farm workers in this country to keep our costs low has been really a breeding ground for modern day slavery. Due to the migratory and isolated nature of farm work, modern day slavery is all too common in the agricultural sector. According to the International Labor Organization, migrant workers are more than 3 times likely to be in forced labor than non-migrant adult workers. It's an especially difficult environment for them. In our Harvest of Justice resources, we put together with the cooperation of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, a short video that I want to show now about modern day slavery and what they're doing to address that.
Is there sound? I think
Yes.
you need to reshare your screen, but hit the sound button.
workers and the Fair Food Program
Oh, there we go.
about 30 years now. The Modern Day Slavery Museum is within a cargo truck that is the same make and model of a box truck that was used to house farm workers against their will in a case in 2008. And the workers were held inside, padlocked in at night. They had to go to the bathroom inside. Workers in that case were also at times even chained to posts. But one worker managed one night to gouge a hole in the roof of the door and get out. And what he did then was, instead of just taking off and thinking about his own safety, he actually got a ladder and came back and helped the rest of his co-workers escape, which is, I just think that is something really extraordinary that, you know, we hope we would all do in that situation. And within the museum is indictments, photographs, newspaper stories about all the various modern day slavery investigations that we started, and then also worked with federal authorities in order to get to prosecution. I think one really telling thing is that, you know, museum's supposed to be about history. And this museum is about history when you're talking about the Fair Food Program and the farms participating in the program, because there is no more forced labor going on in those Fair Food Program farms. Outside of the Fair Food Program, in the fields of farms, whether it be in Florida or in the Southeast or elsewhere, that are not participating, these types of forced labor cases are ongoing. And we needed to become history everywhere. What's outrageous about it is that there's a solution. So you can describe a terrible problem, but it's all the more outrageous when there's a clear solution to it, and that problem still continues to exist.
Me llamo Leo y soy parte de la coalición de trabajadores de Immokalee, y también queremos exponer. Esto es un museo de esclavitud moderna que la coalición hemos creado básicamente para llevar un poco de información, cómo han sido los problemas en el lugar del trabajo de muchos trabajadores y por qué nuestra organización sigue luchando para eliminar esos tipos de abuso. Y lo más triste que es porque siguen pasando estos casos hoy en día. El trabajo de la coalición es luchar en contra del abuso, de la explotación hacia los trabajadores. Y pues hoy en día la coalición tiene el programa Por Comida Justa como una solución para eliminar esos tipos de abuso. Esto básicamente cuenta un poco sobre la historia de lo que es la esclavitud en este país, y pues también cómo fue evolucionando la esclavitud, cómo fue transformando en diferentes maneras, aunque se dice que sí se eliminaron, pero para nosotros muchos de estos siguen pasando, nada más que no se puede ver de la misma manera. Como estas situaciones también, después de esto vemos también la situación de blancos pobres o afroamericanos que siguieron siendo también esclavos, eso, pero ya en parte de nosotros, como parte de la organización, son casos que hemos descubierto que están adentro de este camión, y esto es como una réplica de unos casos, de un caso donde trabajadores vivían en este camión, donde vivían, ahí dormían, ahí trabajaban, los llevaban a labor, y al fin del día pues los encerraban básicamente dentro de este camión de trabajo. Entonces son casos que hemos visto que están básicamente dentro del camión y es una manera que nosotros también usamos el museo de ir en diferentes iglesias para llevar información en diferentes universidades donde vieron que esto es algo que no se puede ver en otros lugares más que en la coalición. En el caso Flores también, uno de los primeros casos que se empezaron a investigar, donde la mayoría de estos casos son casos que llevaban muchos años de investigación. Una de las razones es porque no hay mucha gente que quiere hablar o trabajadores que no quieren hablar sobre la situación porque son amenazados de muerte. Entonces, cuando se investigan los casos es muy, muy difícil porque nadie entiende la situación que viven los trabajadores. Y por eso también no hay leyes que son fáciles o son rápidos para resolver esos tipos de problemas que enfrentan los trabajadores, o no hay una manera de cómo se investigan. Entonces, la coalición en casos ha hecho investigaciones así encubiertos de ir a trabajar en algunos lugares para ver en realidad si eso está pasando. Entonces, uno de los casos que se ha visto, víctimas pues también han sido parte de nuestra lucha, que han sido parte de forjar una solución. Entonces conocemos muchos trabajadores que han vivido en esta situación y pues eso es algo importante para todos los consumidores, de considerar que hay trabajadores que viven en malas condiciones todavía. Y esa es nuestra lucha, de cómo eliminar estos tipos de casos.
So this here is the St. Johns River. And right here it says Mount Pleasant, Raleigh Plantation. Well, it took a minute to figure out, because of course the map was different then, that was the St. Johns River. The same St. Johns River in modern day times, where Palatka is now, and East Palatka is where the Ron Evans labor camp was, and where, I don't know, 60 to 100 workers were held against their will from the 1980s through 2007. And it just shows the the 3 centuries of forced labor in that soil. The trafficker would go to cities across the Southeast, homeless shelters in New Orleans, Birmingham, Tampa, Orlando, Miami, and come by with a van promising to people who were without a home a job and a roof over their heads, which of course is what someone would want when they're trying to get their life back on track. But instead, he would keep them in these labor camps in North Florida and the Carolinas and quickly have them in debt for food and rent and all manner of things. And the Department of Justice was calling it, after the sentencing in 2007, form of servitude. It was morally and legally reprehensible. And it's just, this is an example of one of the cases that's discussed in the museum for people to go through and learn about.
And so just to help us understand that this is continuing to be uncovered, one of the most recent cases of modern day slavery include an Operation Blooming Onion in Georgia, where more than 100 farm workers faced wage theft and physical abuse and were illegally transported. 2 died due to heat exposure. It's an ongoing case, but 24 people were indicted in that case in Georgia. That's just been within the last 3 years. So many farm workers are reticent to bring it up because of their fear of being harmed or even killed. It's very hard to be able to prove it because so much of it goes underground as soon as anyone's aware that there's an investigation. But this continues to happen today. We're grateful for the efforts of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and other farm worker unions and organizing groups around the country that try to monitor these situations and report them and help them come to trial. So the other piece of looking at farm workers and racism in this country is just the loss of farm workers of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. In 1920, Black farmers made up 14% of all the farmers in the U.S. They now make up less than 5% of all the U.S. farmers. And it's estimated that Black farmers lost around $326 billion worth of land within the 20th century. Much of this loss is due simply to discriminatory practices. And that's these statistics in no way represent Native peoples who were first on this land and their lives as farmers. So farm workers lead the way. National Farm Worker Ministry supports farm workers around the country who are organizing and leading campaigns to change their working and living conditions. The farm worker campaigns include creating consumer pressure on companies, boycotting, calling on elected politicians, and or supporting certification programs such as the one that was just featured in the video that we saw. Campaigns can be local, regional, national, and even global. And that brings us now to a pause in this so that we can hear a bit more from Rosalinda Guillon. And she's on with us, and we're going to have a conversation with her. Irene.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Rosalinda.
Hi.
Hi, Rosalinda.
Hello, everybody.
So for this community conversation, we have a few questions that we would like to pose and, just open up the discussion as well. So the first question is, how do you see racism impacting farm workers in 2023?
Well, I mean, when you ask in 2023, I was a farm worker starting at the age of 10 in 1960. And so there really, when you look at what's going on in agriculture and especially in rural areas of the United States, racism is forever present. And it impacts us in a big way. Farm worker families across the country are impacted by this racism because it doesn't just stay in the fields. Racism, because of, I think that video that you just saw on slavery in agriculture, the recent cases that are the really, really super extreme cases that have been pointed out and fought against, that are really severe. And I believe that for every case of that kind of slavery in agriculture that you see, there's probably 5, 10, or 15 other cases that nobody knows about that is continuing to happen all across the country. And for us, the modern day slavery, the most, the most critical modern day slavery program today is, in our opinion, is the H-2A program. We believe that the H-2A program is a modern day legalized slavery program that is being accepted as a way to bring in workers into the United States from impoverished nations, impoverished people that are desperate to earn a living, and they're brought to the United States in a very legal way, with a permit, a work permit. But when we look at the, in rural areas of the United States where H-2A labor camps are located, they're like prisons. They're surrounded, by fences, most of them. They're isolated in areas where there's no community, where there are no services. They're moved back and forth in and out of the fields in company-owned vehicles. They have no transportation. They don't know anybody in the community, and they're mandated by law to stay within those living places. They cannot leave that area and go out in the community and just be themselves. And I think in some areas, even in Washington State, in fact, I was just at a meeting at a housing facility for H-2A workers, which looks better. It's much better. It's newer, it's cleaner. It's closer to the city, but nevertheless, these are H-2A workers with permits that don't allow them to participate or interact in the community, as a farm worker. And I think that kind of slavery is becoming insidious. And I think that in our communities in rural areas, farm workers are very concerned that with the abuses that they see, because they interact with some of these H-2A workers. They actually try to visit them in the labor camps. In 2017, we had a case here that we found out later that farm workers for months had been actually delivering food to the H-2A workers because they didn't have enough to eat and they couldn't get out to the city, to the grocery stores to buy their own food. So modern day slavery for us and racism is depicted in the worst case scenario in the within the H-2A program. And I think for us as farm workers, and what farm workers have told us is like, those are our people. We're looking at our people being kept almost like in a prison without rights. And in the meantime, they're also doing the work and taking the jobs that the farm worker families that live in the area used to do. And so it creates this, conflict between us, and it's being created deliberately. And I believe that is such a clear sign of structural racism in the United States and agriculture. That
I'm going to stop you right there because I think
Go
you're
ahead.
about to hit my next question, which is
Yeah.
how do you think racism plays a role overall in the farm labor industry and in our fight for reform?
Exactly, because you don't see any farm workers being brought in from Iceland or, Czechoslovakia or any other countries. These farm workers that are brought into the United States are all people of color, Haitians, Black people, brown people, to be used and then disposed of and removed when they're done with those workers. To me, that is structural racism within agriculture that has been legalized, that is permitted. And in fact, right now it's being promoted as another way to provide labor that can be controlled. So I think that's when you talk about slavery and racism, that control mechanism is the most important mechanism of racism, to be able to control the lives and the movements and the well-being of people of color as much as possible to receive a benefit, a result of production, of profit for only the owner of the business, the land, the owner of the production facility. To me, the modern day slavery in 2023, when you go back, it's almost like it's coming back full circle, but it's accepted and it's being normalized. And that affects families beyond that exponentially because of our some people call it microaggressions. I call it in this case kind of like a macroaggression in a rural community where farm workers are seen only as beasts of burden and tools for the agricultural industry to produce for a profit. To me, that is the clearest, racism across rural United States for farm workers exists all the time, every single day.
Yeah. And I think,
Anyways,
to piggyback off what you're saying, Rosalinda, it's so important for us to recognize, these moments in history, right? And that the root of racism is in our fields, in our own country. And that because of these exclusions and these federal labor laws, like in the 1935 NLRA, right, where all, or well, not all, but specific categories of workers that received that privilege and that benefit of protection under the AFL-CIO, right, they were granted the right to organize without retaliation, that farm workers and domestic workers are excluded, and that these are two categories of employment or work, shall we say, that were traditionally Black labor, right? And that with the requirement for paying overtime, that we still do not have that for farm workers, right? To this day, this law, this legislation from 1938, something that with the stroke of a pen, right, we would think could easily be corrected, still remains. That's part of that structural racism as well.
I would like to add to that it goes beyond that. Those are like the big asks, right? But the right to organize is a how do I want to say it? It's like it's like a dream that is really difficult to accomplish because of the structural racism that goes along with that. The ability for farm workers to organize in a rural area that's majority white, that is politically controlled by white people, in having farm workers organize, as we have seen over and over again, the attempts of farm workers to organize to form a union. We saw it here in Washington State. The attacks, the racist behavior of so many people to try to shut down, to stop farm workers from organizing is still so strong in the United States. And I believe that there's leftover slaveholder mentality in agriculture. It is an industry that was born from slavery, that literally looks at the labor in the fields not as a 100% human being that deserves the same benefits as everybody else in the community, because farm workers have never had the access to medical care. They have never had access to any benefit of any kind that other workers have because of the poverty and the difficulty in organizing themselves into a union. So, all of the access that, all of the other benefits that other workers have and other community members have are difficult for farm workers to access. And so it puts us in an unbalanced situation of power in local community. So I think that it goes beyond that. And for us, it was very important, and we honor the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, because it really called into question, stark question how Black people are treated, but it's also how we're treated, because we recognize that kind of violence against us. And I think while we want those rights, we recognize that structural racism in every aspect of the agricultural industry exists really, really strong. And the agricultural industry has gained an incredible amount of political power. So you're talking about all of the rules. We've been fighting here on heat rules with climate change, the types of rules that protect workers in the job. Of course, we talk about pesticides all the time, but there is no medical benefits for farm workers to be able to survive, the type of work that they do, which is very dangerous work. I believe agriculture is named one of the top 3 most dangerous agricultural and most dangerous jobs in the nation.
And the environment plays such a big role in that. I see that Lilo has joined us as well. We'd like to invite Lilo to join us on screen. But the next question, it ties into that, right? Why do environmental issues disproportionately impact communities of color?
Well, you know, we in Washington State, we helped to write and participated in the passage of the HEAL Act, the Healthy Environment for All Act, which mandated that all state agencies recognize environmental justice and environmental racist impacts on communities of color all across the country. Traditionally, pollution industries that pollute have been placed in areas where our community lived, in Native American reservations, you know, or near reservations or rivers. So, but I would like to point out, structural racism in the industry is so strong that the one agency in Washington State that oversees all worker protections, including agriculture, the labor and industries, will not opt into the HEAL Act and address environmental causes and point out and build worker protections related to climate change and environment. And farm workers work outside. We're outside. I mean, this is an outdoor labor that immediately any change in the environment, we're the first to see it and feel it. And I see Alfredo. I know he was having trouble with the internet, so it's good that he got on camera. I don't know if you want to add to that, Lilo.
Yeah, I just want to say that a lot of the policy around climate, it does not have farm workers' voice, firsthand experience voice in that, and that's very bad, because at the end of it, whatever decision is made, it becomes law. We all have to work under that. And also, what Rosalinda was saying about the LNI is that I only learned about them, that they should be out there helping farm workers, only because I started organizing. I didn't learn about them as a farm worker, but I learned about them as a organizer, and that these are the people that should be, you know, making sure that we are safe. But yeah, since I started organizing in 2012, up to now, I have not met a LNI person at a work site, not once. And it's very frustrating to know, like, there are those agency or the agency that should be going into the fields and making sure that workers are safe, that they're not there. And I think that happens when there isn't a lot of stories from the home workers, or their voice is not taken into account. And there are very few people representing us, and even for them to stand up, fight for that, it's very tough, because they get attacked a lot. And yeah, there's just a lot. And I think in order to have something, a policy or anything work successfully, is to go into the experts themselves and see what they need. And yeah.
Yeah, I see a question in the chat box from Tim, who asked, does the renewal of the Farm Bill provide an opportunity to address any of these issues?
It should provide an opportunity, but this is where the incredible power, the huge power the political lobby has, comes into play. I mean, to impact changes in the Farm Bill has been, and we all know it, for years and years and years, has been almost impossible, because the big players in agriculture are the ones that influence politicians that make the final decisions on farm. And so it should provide an opportunity. And we're trying here in Washington State this year and next year, we are going to be reaching out to farm workers to see how many of the workers actually know there's a farm bill. And more than that, how many farm workers know the relation between their jobs every day in the fields and the farm bill and its impact on their safety. And I think, structural racism in agriculture. So you're talking about racism in agriculture because it was founded on slavery. And there is a wish, in my opinion, for some type of slavery in agriculture still. It's like paying workers the least amount that they have to pay labor. That's what the industry wants. But when you talk about structural racism, that's where I go, when you go deep into the policy making and the rules making and the everyday impact on farm workers, which I think in a certain way, those are microaggressions against people of color that are in the fields producing everybody's foods. Every single little thing that could benefit us has to go through this huge process that is racist and led most of the time, the decision makers are white people and they're professional agricultural people that are looking out for the industries of profit making within the agricultural industry. And so it's really like extremely difficult. I don't know. Do you have other questions, Megan?
Yeah, no worries. We have 2 more questions to get through before we wrap up. But we want to ask, what is land hunger and how does lack of access to land hurt communities?
Oh boy. Farm workers, we are a landless workforce. We're a landless population. We're a landless community. Migrant workers have never had land. Individuals manage to buy a home sometimes in a city, but as a whole, this is the agricultural workforce is a landless workforce. And that yearning for being able to have a piece of land that you can relate to, that you can grow the food the way that you want to work it, is just existing all the time. We have managed to purchase, after much struggle, 60 acres of organic farming land. And I think farm workers are seeing that as a hope. It's like, if we were able to do it, maybe we can do it some more. And we're continuing to try to, purchase more land, but that exists because farm workers don't get to enjoy the skills that they have in a joyful way to produce food the way that they want to produce it, in the product that they want. I don't know if Lelo wants to add to that. I know that he's been out at Cooperativa Tierra Libertad and how it feels like to be working on a piece of land that's yours, that you don't have to ask permission.
Yeah, so as a farm worker, right, I just recently stopped picking blackberries. So as a farm worker, I can say that because there isn't a lot access to land, a lot of us are expert on growing our own food. We can grow a lot of food without pesticides, healthy organic food for everybody in our community. At a very young age, we start harvesting and planting a lot of crops. And so if we had that access to the land, we can grow a lot of healthy organic food for everybody in the community. And Cooperativa, every time I go there, there's just this feeling that's very hard to describe, but it's like very happy and free, right? Because I know that there we have blueberries. There's other crops like the nopales and chickens. We see them running around. It's a very happy feeling and free to be there. Pick blueberries, and if you're tired, just sit down. There's nobody that will get mad at you. Nobody that forces you to produce a certain amount of pounds berries at the end of the day, or else you don't get paid, or any of that. And so I really believe that everybody should have access to land, or they can either grow their own food or grow organic, healthy food for everybody in the community. And yeah, these pesticides are very dangerous to us. We've seen this a lot, and like the tulip, we also pick tulip where the companies put pesticides nearby fields, and they all come to us, and we're breathing those in, and it's not safe. And going from that, working for a company that does that, to a place where there's no boss. It's it's completely different.
Thank you.
I believe that you can't really, the hunger, the land hunger, you feel it, but you don't express it. And you try to protect yourself, you know, by trying to live a good life. But when you actually go to a piece of land that you know is community owned, because that land is part of a land trust that we're starting. And so our goal is to buy more land and grow the land trust so that the land can't be sold. It can be used for community, that when people go and feel what it feels like actually feel what it might be like to have a piece of land and farm it the way that you want, then that's when the reality of the possibilities hit you. But then the other component, the other part that really, I know because I've talked to some of the farm workers at the co-op, it's like the racism in agriculture becomes more clear, and you have more courage to speak out against it because you have a solution to it, right? When you have an alternative that you can go to, then you can more directly call out the racism and the abuse that the industry has given farm workers for generations for profit. So I think that this is something that we have to, I almost sometimes think that we are owed by the industry for generations of, like my family have been migrant workers since the 1930s. My family has helped the agricultural industry become rich and powerful. And I think that we deserve something for that in this country. There's no recognition of, you know, the benefit that the agricultural industry has. It's not a benefit, it's an extraction of our culture, of our skills, of our families, of our well-being, so that they can profit from it. And yet it continues to this day. You know, before we leave, I want to go back to the H-2A program in modern day slavery and the racism that exists at such a huge level. That the worst thing that's happening now is that the H-2A program is being linked to immigration and to immigration reform, which is something that our community has been yearning for. Comprehensive immigration reform that allows farm workers and their families to reach a point of legalization and residence so that they can have more opportunities, right? And now that hope and dream is being linked to a modern day slavery program like the H-2A. I think that is the worst and clearest example of the racism that continues to be held up in the agricultural industry. And I think the challenge for all of us is to keep calling it out and begin to undo it. We can't continue policies that hold up the racist infrastructure in food production in the United States and then call it food security, right? Then you call it food security because we're providing food for the world. Well, on our backs, that's something that has to end. And I think these kinds of webinars are really helpful because it allows us the ability to to say our truth. This is what it is. And we don't need to like shy away from it. I'm a farm worker. I'm 72 years old. I'm a farm worker, and I have been used, and my father was used, and my grandfather was used and worn out to make the industry rich. And I won't be quiet about it. It needs to change. And we need to be really clear when there's an aggression, a racist aggression being promoted in the name of policy and change and in a future for undocumented people. That is not a future. Being in the H-2A program is not a future. It's not comprehensive immigration reform. I think these discussions really need to start to happen in a very clear, truthful way.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, we have one last question we want to get through, and it's a good one. Now, the National Farm Worker Ministry, we seek to support farm workers across the nation who have many similarities, but also specific differences in diverse localities. What can our national supporters do to support farm workers in general? Is there specific legislation to support? Anything else? And then before we go to the next slide, what can a national base do to support your work in Washington State, even if we don't live there? And what can supporters in Washington State do to boost your work?
You want to go ahead, Lilo?
Yeah, I'm gonna answer this as a farm worker, you know. Here's what we need. Again, you know, from different states have, you know, in each farm worker sector, there's a bit of different need because the job is done a bit differently. But what we all need is more protection. We want hazard pay, healthcare, obviously, and you again, either an agency or something from the state that actually follows through with holding companies accountable every time that they do a form worker wrong, or if there's a policy that that policy is reached, the farm workers knows about it. Something that happened here in the state, in Washington State, was when the HUBRO passed. For I knew about it because Familias Unidas and Community told us about it, and as an organizer, I heard about it, and I told everybody in the field where I worked, and this is Skagit, Whatcom County, where we're located at. People heard about it as soon as it passed. But when we went an hour away from this, more in the middle of Washington, like the Yakima area, we went on a tour for 7 days just to talk to other farm workers, like the people that are picking apples, cherries, you know, the different other jobs. They didn't know about this. When the overtime passed in the state, a lot of them did not know that they qualify for overtime. When it started in 2022, it was when you work over 55 hours, you can get overtime. They didn't know about that. They didn't know that this year in 2023, it was going to be any hours over the 48 hours that was going to be have to be paid as a overtime. They did not know about that. Or the little information they got was the company you're working for is a small company and it does not have to pay you overtime. And that's completely wrong. And so again, it's how do we support farm workers, talking to farm workers in different areas and see what they need, but in general, what all farm worker needs, hazard pay, healthcare, and more work protection. So yeah, as a farm worker, and as somebody who organizes some farm workers, I really see that's what we need. And when you dive into like specific job the farm workers do, there's a bit of different need there, but again, we can find that out by reaching out to them. And the other big thing that we all, you know, could do is when there is a strike or farm worker walkout and demand change, that we simply show up and support them. That does go a long way, and yeah, I say those are the stuff we need.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Such important and powerful information shared. And I'm sure that all of our participants on our workshop today have learned so much from your lived experiences and all that you have shared. So we want to share.
No, I just wanted to say on a national level, those of you that are watching or want to support farm workers or look at what are the things that you can do, right? Here in Whatcom County, we passed a countywide food systems plan. So when you look at food systems plans or food policy councils or any kind of policy that involves food, make sure that you include farm workers and labor. Make sure there's a labor component to anything, any policy anywhere that you're looking at to improve the food system at the local level. I think that there's a lot of opportunities at the local level with well-meaning folks with food bank organizations and other food organizations and local politicians that want to improve food system or look at climate change, don't please add labor and farm workers to that. Also, I think when you look at any kind of, as Lilo was saying, any kind of policy related to climate change or climate protections, hazard pay for farm workers during epidemics or, you know, pandemics or climate crisis should be included. There should be a state budget that includes a fund for hazard pay for farm workers when they can't work because of climate, because of heat domes or floods or fires and smoke, that there needs to be that kind of protection for farm workers. And I believe that, you know, what Lilo was talking about and the dream that we've had is that every state should have an agency led by farm workers, for farm workers, to oversee the labor component of the agricultural industry. And more than anything, the enforcement mechanisms for farms and farmers that abuse farm workers. Farm workers die all the time at work. Check those out. It's like your tractor broke or something. It's not like a human being was hurt, you know. And I think that that's something we really need to look at. Farms that are not following the rules or abusing farm workers, they need to go to prison. They need to be held accountable for the abuse. So there is not enough enforcement anywhere. And, you know, you talk about the farm bill. Well, where's the, you know, the enforcement mechanisms for farm workers in agriculture are almost non-existent. Thank you for the time.
No, thank you so much for all that. So as we get our slide deck back up, we would love for you all joining us here today to join us in taking action. Utilize the National Farm Worker Ministries campaign pages to assist with anything that you might need in terms of specific information about these legislative efforts. These are the specific names of and numbers of each legislation for anybody who wants them, and I'll also drop them in the chat box. We have the Asuncion Valdivia Heat, Illness, Injury, and Fatality Prevention Act of 2023, the Fairness for Farm Workers Act, Justice for Black Farmers Act, and Increasing Land Access, Security, and Opportunities Act. So let me drop that in the chat box for you.
Well, and let me also say that we'll send you the bill numbers and information about these. They're also included in the Harvest of Justice resources. Each week there were actions to take, and we address these in more detail during the season. So those resources are available on our website.
Absolutely. And of course, we would love for you to support our farm worker campaigns, boycott Wendy's. We have lots of resources on our website on Wendy's and a handy dandy map that we would love for you to help us fill in so that we do letter deliveries at every Wendy's location, encouraging them, strongly urging them, right? Nudge, nudge, to join the Fair Food Program. And of course, utilize all of those other wonderful resources that we have online. So in closing,
Can we ask you to add HR?
I'm sorry.
Could I ask you to add HR 1511, the
Yeah.
registry bill, which is a legalization bill?
Absolutely. We will make sure to get that out as well in the email when we follow
Okay,
up
thank
with
you.
the recording of our presentation as well. And then are there any other questions by chance? Please feel free to drop them in the chat box. I know we are running short on time, a little bit over the clock. So we will make sure to follow up with all of you. Just make sure to drop those in the chat box before we wrap up. And of course, there are other ways to support farm workers that we would love for you to join us in. As always, we seek allies who will walk with us to help us loosen the bonds of economic and racial injustice wherever it may be. It is our hope that from this training, you will take some time to reflect on these words, on the shared experiences of our partners, and, you know, consider joining us during a future mobilization as we strive to create a more just and sacred society. And to close, I would love to leave you with some words from Frederick Douglass, right? If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle, because we know power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Thank you.
Right.